In the heart of a fractured Japan, a land ablaze with ambition and betrayal, a single man would rise from nothing to become a king. His story is not one of noble birth or samurai honor. It is a tale of cunning, ruthlessness, and a hunger for power so profound it would earn him the name. The Viper of Mino. This is the story of Saitō Dōsan, the oil merchant who stole a nation. The 16th century, Japan's Ashikaga shogunate had crumbled, and the authority of the emperor was a distant memory. It was an age of Gekokujō, a time when the low could overthrow the high, and anyone with enough nerve and a sharp sword could carve out their own destiny. In this crucible of chaos, our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the quiet halls of a Kyoto monastery. He was born Minamaru, and his first calling was that of a Buddhist monk, but the chants and prayers could not quiet the storm brewing within him. He left the monastery, trading his robes for the humble clothes of an oil merchant, peddling his wares on the dusty roads of Mino province. But this was no ordinary merchant. He possessed a brilliant mind and a performer's charm. He developed a trick, pouring oil through the hole of a single coin without spilling a drop, a spectacle that drew crowds and built his reputation. But behind the charming smile was a calculating mind. He wasn't just selling oil, he was studying people. He was learning the currency of power, not in gold, but in secrets, favors, and weaknesses. In the rigid hierarchy of feudal Japan, a merchant was near the bottom. To become a samurai was almost unthinkable. But Dōsan saw a world where the old rules were breaking. His father had already taken the first step, and Dōsan would not just take a step, he would take a leap. Using his father's connections, Dōsan entered the service of the Toki clan, the established rulers of Mino. He was the perfect servant, efficient, loyal, and utterly indispensable. He made himself the Lord's shadow, anticipating his every need. Lord Toki Yorinari saw a faithful retainer. He did not see the viper coiling at his feet. One by one, those who stood in his way began to disappear. Rivals died in convenient accidents. Powerful officials were disgraced by sudden scandals. Dōsan's hands always appeared clean. He was a master of the long game. In 1542, the final piece fell into place. After years of systematic manipulation, Dōsan turned on his master, driving him from the province and seizing his castle, his lands, and his power. The oil merchant was gone. In his place stood Saitō Dōsan, the new lord of Mino. He had achieved the impossible. He had stolen a nation, but holding a stolen kingdom is harder than taking it. To the east, a powerful clan, the Oda, watched him with hungry eyes. His solution would be a masterstroke of political genius, a decision that would bind his fate to a young, unpredictable fool, a boy who would one day be known as the great unifier of Japan, Oda Nobunaga. Power in the Sengoku period was a bloody game of King of the Hill. Having seized Mino, Dōsan immediately faced his first great test from the ambitious warlord Oda Nobunaga, father of the famous Nobunaga. The established powers were not going to let a low-born upstart keep his stolen prize. At the Battle of Kanguchi in 1547, Dōsan proved he was more than just a schemer. He was a brilliant military commander. He crushed the Oda forces, sending Nobunaga back to Owari in defeat. The victory sent a shockwave across Japan. The Viper of Mino was a name now spoken with fear and respect. But Dōsan was a pragmatist. He knew that endless war would bleed his new kingdom dry, so he made a deal with his defeated enemy. A truce, sealed not with a treaty, but with blood. He would give his beloved daughter, Kitch, to Nobunaga's eccentric son and heir, a young man widely known as the Fool of Owari, Oda Nobunaga. In this era, marriage was not about love, it was a tool of statecraft. Saryaku Kekken, or political marriage, was the ultimate way to forge an alliance. A daughter was a bargaining chip, her life forfeit to the ambitions of her father. Kitch, who would become known as Enheim, the princess of Mino, was now a spy in her husband's home, a guarantee of peace, or a trigger for war. The legends say that Dōsan, deeply suspicious of his new son-in-law, arranged a meeting to intimidate, perhaps even assassinate the young fool. He arrived with a small army, hiding spearmen along the road. But Nobunaga, ever the showman, arrived with an even larger retinue, armed not with spears, but with rifles, the terrifying new weapons from the west. He had outplayed the master of intrigue at his own game. During their meeting, the fool vanished. In his place was a man of startling intelligence and boundless ambition. He spoke of a united Japan, a vision that even D-san had never dared to dream. As Nobunaga departed, D-san turned to his retainers and uttered words that would become legend. "Mark my words, my sons will one day be tying the horses for that fool." He saw the future of Japan, and it was not his own bloodline. This revelation became a dangerous obsession. D-san grew to favor his brilliant son-in-law over his own children, especially his eldest son, Yoshitatsu. And then there was the rumor, a poisonous whisper that had haunted the family for years. Was Yoshitatsu truly D-san's son, or was he the biological child of the man D-san had betrayed? It was a doubt D-san himself may have cultivated, a seed of discord that was about to bear bitter fruit. Feeling cornered, despised by his own father, and fearing he would be disinherited, Yoshitatsu decided to act. The Viper had taught his son many lessons in ruthlessness and betrayal. Now, that son would turn those lessons against his own master. In 1555, the simmering resentment within the House of Saitō exploded into open violence. Convinced his father planned to replace him, Saitō Yoshitatsu made a preemptive strike. He murdered his two brothers in cold blood, eliminating his rivals for succession. The betrayal was absolute. The war between father and son had begun. Yoshitatsu was his father's son. He was cunning and politically astute. He rallied the majority of the Mino samurai to his cause, painting D-san as a cruel, illegitimate tyrant. He positioned himself as the rightful heir, possibly even a descendant of the old Toki lords he was avenging. The retainers of Mino, seeing a chance to restore the old order, flocked to his side. D-san, the master manipulator, found himself dangerously isolated. The final confrontation was set for April of 1556, along the banks of the Nagara River. D-san was vastly outnumbered. He could only muster around 2,700 loyal followers against Yoshitatsu's massive army of over 17,500. He knew the odds were impossible. Before marching to his final battle, he performed one last act of political defiance. He wrote a will, not for his rebellious son, but for his son-in-law. In it, he bequeathed the entire province of Mino to Oda Nobunaga. It was his final move in the great game, a posthumous checkmate. The battle was a slaughter, but the old Viper would not go quietly. At 62 years old, he fought like a demon, his spear and sword a blur of motion, a terrifying figure of defiance against the tide of his own son's army. Help was on its way. Oda Nobunaga, true to his alliance, had dispatched troops to save his father-in-law, but it was too little too late. They would not reach the battlefield in time. As his strength failed him, surrounded and bleeding from a dozen wounds, legend says D-san looked upon his son's masterful command of the battlefield. In that final moment, hatred was eclipsed by a flicker of paternal pride. Saitō D-san, the Viper of Mino, was dead. His head was taken as a trophy, his body left on the blood-soaked banks of the Nagara River. He had lived by the sword and died by the sword. His last reported words were not a curse, but a poem of weary resignation. Even if I were to cast it aside, I have no place to go beyond this world. Where then could I find a final home? D-san's life was over, but his death was not an end, it was a beginning. In his final act, he had passed the torch to the one man he believed could finish what he started. The Viper was dead, but his venom was now in Nobunaga's hands. With his father's head on a pike, Saitō Yoshitatsu was the undisputed master of Mino. He had won. But victory, born from patricide, is a hollow prize. A man who would kill his own father could not be trusted. Yoshitatsu's reign was short and troubled. He was a capable ruler, but he could never escape the shadow of his father's murder. The Viper's venom, the culture of betrayal and mistrust, had infected the very foundations of the Saitō clan. Just a few years after his victory, Yoshitatsu died of a sudden illness, leaving the clan in the hands of his own young, inexperienced son. Meanwhile, in the neighboring province, D-san's death had ignited a fire. Oda Nobunaga now possessed the cause. D-san's will, which gifted him the province of Mino, was the perfect justification, a taigai maibin, for invasion. He was not a foreign conqueror, he was the rightful heir, fulfilling the last wish of his respected father-in-law. It was a political masterstroke D-san himself would have admired. For years, Nobunaga chipped away at the crumbling Saitō domain. Then, in 1567, he launched his final assault on their stronghold, the mountain fortress of Inabiyama. The castle that was the symbol of Dōsan's power, the prize he had stolen, now fell to his son-in-law. Nobunaga renamed it Gifu Castle, the base from which he would launch his campaign to unify Japan. The Saitō clan was extinguished, just 11 years after Dōsan's death. This is the ultimate legacy of Saitō Dōsan. His life was a cautionary tale, but his death was the catalyst for one of the most important moments in Japanese history. By seizing Mino, he created a powerful domain. By recognizing Nobunaga's genius, he chose the perfect successor. And by being overthrown by his own son, he handed Nobunaga the perfect excuse to take it all. Without the Viper of Mino, the story of Japan's unification might have been very different. Was Dōsan a villain, a ruthless tyrant who got what he deserved? Or was he a visionary, a product of his chaotic times, who understood that to build a new world, the old one had to be torn down? He was a paradox, a destroyer and a creator. In the end, Dōsan's greatest creation was not the kingdom he stole, but the future he enabled. He was the dark mentor who tested, challenged, and ultimately unleashed Japan's greatest unifier. His story is a timeless lesson that from the deepest betrayals can rise the most enduring legacies, and that sometimes the Viper's poison is the only antidote.